Hello. I'm sure you've heard of Charles Dickens, who wrote The Tale of Two Cities, David Copperfield, A Christmas Carol, among so many other great works. Well, he said the following. Here's his quote: "The Northern onslaught upon slavery was no more than a piece of spacious humbug designed to conceal its desire for economic control of the Southern states. My name is Mary Stevens. My email address is marystevens, Stevens, 827 at gmail.com. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments about what you're going to see and hear today in this video. This video is about how wrong it is for our country to change the names of the 10 military bases named for our highly celebrated Confederate generals. The Civil War, which Southerners call the War for Southern Independence, was not a war to free slaves. There were 5 slave states in the North: Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, West Virginia, and Delaware. So why would Lincoln allow slave states in the Union if he was fighting to end slavery? It just doesn't make any sense. Also, read Lincoln's first inaugural address. He clearly stated that he would not interfere with slavery. So if the South wanted assurances of slavery, all it had to do was remain in the Union. Now here's another quote from New York City Mayor in 1864, which of course would be near the end of the war. And this mayor, whose name is Fernando Wood, said the following. Here's his quote: "The charge that slavery was the cause of the war is notoriously false. No government can be lasting that is not founded on the consent of the government." I want you to read sometime "Slavery Was Not the Cause of the War" by Gene Kaiser Jr., who lives in Charleston, South Carolina. Now here's a copy of his book. The Union attacked the South. Only after the South seceded did Lincoln declare war on the South. The South's secession is what triggered the war. Lincoln knew that the North would go broke without the South in the Union. Here's a statement from the New York Evening Post at this time. "If the taxes aren't collected from the South, then the sources which supply our treasury will be dried up. We shall have no money to carry on the government. The nation will become bankrupt before the next crop of corn is ripe." I want to point out there was no income tax at this time. No wonder the northern states loved the Union, and no wonder Abraham Lincoln said over and over for the first 2 years of the war that the purpose of the war was to preserve the Union, not end slavery. The North needed to continue their business with the South, such as shipping cotton, and the South had to pay into the Treasury a tariff that they collected and which was spent mostly in the North on its infrastructure. Virginia and 3 other states did not secede until Lincoln marched 75,000 troops into the South. Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, you will find no references to slavery in Virginia's secession papers. Some people will mention the Emancipation Proclamation. It was written after 2 years into the war and after the North lost several major battles. There were 2 Emancipation Proclamations. The first stated that if the South did not return to the Union, slaves would be freed. Lincoln still trying to entice the South to return to the Union. So in the end, he wrote the final Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln freed only slaves in the South, where he had no control, and he was hoping they would revolt like slaves in Haiti had done in the late 1700s. The final Emancipation Proclamation failed to mention slaves in the North, whom Lincoln could easily free. So why didn't Lincoln free Northern slaves if slavery had been his top priority? Besides, the South had seceded, so Lincoln had no authority to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and free Southern slaves. Slavery was not just a Southern thing. It was the northeastern states of New York, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts that brought slaves here, not the South. The stars and stripes flew in front of the slave ships, not any Confederate flag. These northern states have no right to point fingers at the South, and the North made a fortune off the slave trade business. The first slaves imported directly from Africa to Massachusetts arrived in 1634. In 1641, Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop, a slave owner himself, wrote the first law legalizing slavery in North America, the Massachusetts Bodies of Liberty, which the General Court passed in December 1641. That is, Massachusetts became the first colony to legalize slavery. So why did Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren initiate a change to remove the military base names? Why didn't she make some concession for Massachusetts' role in slavery? So perhaps Senator Warren and Massachusetts will be the first state to contribute toward reparations for slavery. Josiah Franklin, stepbrother of Benjamin Franklin, has his name associated with slavery, being a slave dealer in Boston. Of course, we know the name John Hancock, signatory of the Declaration of Independence. He was a slave owner and a slave trader and former Massachusetts governor. Samuel Huntington of Connecticut and Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island have their names on the Declaration of Independence and were slave owners. At the end of the 1700s, there were more slaves in New York than in Georgia. Yale University was named for slave trader Elihu Yale. That's spelled Elihu. Why don't they change the name since Yale was named for a slave trader? Harvard has deep ties to slavery and should lose its name. These are just a few examples of the North's involvement in slave ownership and slave trading. For more information, go to slavenorth.com and read the book, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery by Farrah Langan Frank. I've got a copy of that book. Here's a copy of that book. Also, let me point out another book that is very good. The South Was Right by the Kennedy brothers, and they live in Louisiana. And this is their first edition, but they've got a second and a third edition out. And they're twin brothers that live in Louisiana. President Bill Clinton was about to take a trip to Africa in 1998. Clinton was preparing an apology for slavery. The Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni, Museveni, who received President Clinton, said he blamed black traders more than white Europeans for the 17th and 18th century trade in people. African chiefs, he said, were the ones waging war on each other and capturing their own people and selling them, he said. If anyone should apologize, it should be the African chiefs. We still have those traders here even today. When Lincoln learned that Maryland was about to secede, Lincoln jailed Maryland newspaper editors who spoke against him along with Maryland's judges. In fact, Lincoln jailed anyone who disagreed with him. I was disappointed to hear Virginia Senator Kaine say, if you declare war on the United States, take up arms against it, and kill U.S. troops, you should not have a military base named after you. Senator Kaine, the South was invaded, and Southerners were in the U.S. military long before and after the Civil War. Many whose ancestors and descendants fought in the American Revolution and Mexican American Wars and other battles. The South was tricked by Lincoln into making the first shot on Fort Sumter, and no one was killed. However, that gave Lincoln an excuse to illegally march 75,000 troops into the South and start an illegal war that resulted in the deaths of more than 700,000 Americans. And the South sent a peace coalition to meet with Lincoln, but he refused to meet with them. Senator Kaine walked on the graves of Virginia's Confederate sons and Virginia where they spilled their blood. Before and after the war, many Southerners and Confederate descendants fought for the United States. And I want you to see these pictures of these patriots. The first one, of course, is, I'm sure you recognize him, President Harry S. Truman. And of course, he's responsible for the Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine, NATO, and he was a former member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The second gentleman is the famous Audie Murphy, and he was an actor, but he was also a soldier, and a highly decorated one in World War II. Unfortunately, we lost him in 1971, excuse me, in a plane crash. But he's buried in Arlington. And at the bottom is Sergeant York, and he was a highly decorated soldier in World War I. And he had two granduncles that were in the Confederacy. Then, of course, we have all these Confederate descendants of Confederates. And I'm sure you know the name, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Well, this is his great-grandson that fought in World War II. And he was killed in action in Germany in World War II. And of course, he's related to the famous Confederate general Nathan Bedford Forrest. And then there's Thomas Jonathan Jackson. He's the great-grandson of the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. And he was shot down over France in 1944. And he's the great-grandson of the great Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. And then at the bottom, of course, everybody knows this name, General George Smith Patton Jr. And he was related to the Confederate, his grandfather, who was Confederate George S. Patton Sr. And of course, he was the most successful field commander there is. So I'm sure you can see the great effect that descendants of the Confederate soldiers have had on our nation and its military history. The South did not want to destroy the United States. The South wanted to leave the Union just like the colonies did in 1776. Now, here's a statement from Lincoln in 1848. Any people, anywhere, being inclined and having the power, have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. Senator Kaine, you still believe the lies that the Confederacy is about white supremacy and slavery? First, more than 85 to 90% of Southerners had no slaves. There was no white supremacy. And I want to show you some more pictures. Um, I've got a flyer here with names of South Carolina African Americans that received Confederate pensions in 1923 to 1925. If anybody wants to see a copy of this, please email me and I'll be glad to share it with you. And then here's a lovely family from South Carolina, and they are descendants of a lady named Lavinia Corley Thompson, an African American lady, and here they are on the steps of the Capitol of South Carolina in Columbia, receiving a proclamation for her. Now, she was received a pension because even though she was a cook, you're right there, and she's in harm's way. So she was entitled to receive a pension. Then there were Jewish Americans. This gentleman up here is a very well-known Jewish American of the 19th century. His name was Judah Benjamin. He was a lawyer, a senator, and he was sort of like the second in command in the Confederacy. Then over here is the famous Cherokee General Stan Waddy. And he was one of the last Confederate generals to surrender at the end of the war. At the bottom, these two gentlemen are Hispanics and represent the many Hispanics that fought for the Confederacy. One is named Captain Cristobal Benavides, and he fought for the Confederacy out of Texas. And next to him is Captain Joseph de la Garza, and he was unfortunately killed in the Battle of Mansfield, Louisiana. Now, I have a list online of the many Hispanics that fought for the Confederacy. I don't know how many are on this list, way over 1,000, I'm sure. And they were mostly from Cuba, Mexico, and Puerto Rico. And they fought mostly for the Confederacy out of Louisiana and Texas. Then there's, last but not least, a famous African American named Holt Collier. Let me get his picture. Here's Holt Collier, and he was a sharpshooter, and he fought for Texas as a Confederate. He was also known for being a bear guide, hunting bear guide for President Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt was so impressed with him that he honored him with a Winchester rifle. Then in 2004, the Fish and Wildlife Agency named over 2,200 acres in Mississippi for Holt Collier. It became the Holt Collier National Wildlife Refuge. And here's a picture of some information about this. And then here's, last but not least, in this group are two ladies, African American ladies who had descendants, Confederate descendants, and they are in Confederate organizations today. The first one on the left is Teresa Roane, Roane, and then this is Mrs. Maddie Claiborne Rice. Now, if you go online on YouTube and pull up Teresa Roan's name, Roane, you'll hear her speak. She does a lot of public speaking, and you can listen to some of her speeches. Senator Kaine. Slavery was immoral, of course, but it was legal in the United States and other places around the world. I would like to emphasize that not every person of color was a slave. Many free African Americans joined the Confederacy as soldiers, teamsters, cooks, laborers, chaplains, and musicians. There were many people of color who had slaves themselves. In 1830, there were 3,775 free blacks who had 12,740 black slaves. Slaves were allowed to have jobs, own land, keep their earnings, and own businesses. Slavery existed for thousands of years in Africa. Most slaves brought to America from Africa were procured from black slave owners or African tribal leaders. Initially, slaves in the colonies were indentured service. That meant they were given their freedom after a certain number of years in servitude. Court records in 1641 indicated that Anthony Johnson, and I've got a picture of him, Anthony Johnson was a master to a black servant named John Casor, Casor, who would become the first person to be arbitrarily declared a slave for life in the United States in a 1655 court case. Johnson's neighbor and white planter, Robert Parker, had secured Casor's freedom after he convinced Parker that Johnson did not release him from servitude as promised. But Johnson fought to retain ownership of Casor in a lengthy court battle, and he won. Casor was the first to be declared a slave for life as a result of the civil suit. America's first slave owner, documented in colonial Northampton court records in 1654, was a person of color, tobacco farmer Anthony Johnson, and I just showed you his picture. Here's another picture of a person of color named Nicholas Augustin Meteor of Louisiana, and I think he looks very distinguished. In the early 1800s, he and his family were persons of color who had more than 200 slaves. Now, I want you to remember this: over 1.5 million white Europeans captured for slavery in the 19th century by Barbary Coast pirates, and Barbary Coast is North Africa. How about reparations for these white Europeans? Today, slavery is still practiced in some African and Arab countries. Let's end slavery in those places. In colonial times, women like myself were considered second-class citizens. We could not vote or be on juries. In fact, black men got the right to vote before women like I did. The 15th Amendment in 1870 gave black men the right to vote, and it wasn't until 1920 that people like I got the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. President Grover Cleveland was against women's suffrage. Should we remove his pictures or statues from where they exist for his views on women's suffrage? It is wrong to make judgments about the past based on today's views and mores. Senator Kaine, you said the Confederacy tore the country in half so that the seceding southern states could continue to own those of African descent as slaves. President Lincoln did everything in his power to entice the southern states to return to the Union. In 1861, Lincoln and Congress passed the Corwin Amendment, Corwin, that made slavery permanent without interference from the federal government. Had slavery been a primary issue for the South, all the South had to do was remain in the Union. But slavery was not the primary concern for the South. Their independence was. In late 1864, President Davis sent Louisiana legislator Duncan Kenner to both England and France. His mission was to seek support and recognition of Confederacy from these two countries, and in return, the South would end slavery. The South knew that slavery would be ending soon and wanted their willingness to end slavery as leverage for European support. Unfortunately, Kenner's negotiations ended due to Confederate General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Senator Kaine said the war and slavery reminded African Americans of a painful past. That is baloney. There is a legacy museum in Montgomery, Alabama that contains stories and artwork about slavery, and a slave ship museum is being built in New Orleans and opens next year. If some people are in so much pain, why do these museums exist? One of my African American friends has a daughter who got her law degree from Washington Lee University. Her attendance at Washington Lee caused her no pain. Speaking of a painful past, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman often ordered his soldiers, many who were street criminals from northern as well as European cities, to shoot southern civilians at random. His troops burned down complete towns, businesses, schools, churches, confiscated animals, destroyed crops, stole everything of value, and destroyed what they could not carry. Read this book, What Yankees Did to Us by Stephen Davis. And also there's another book that's similar, War Crimes Against Southern Civilians by Walter Cisco. Like I said, it's a similar book. Now, this is by a gentleman named Stephen Davis, and I've met him. The Union soldiers threw dead animal carcasses into wells so Southerners would become sick or die if they drank the contaminated well water. Union troops also threatened servants to reveal where silver and other valuables were hidden. There's a story I read about Sherman's troops who went into the home of a lady in Little Rock, Arkansas, and they held her leg over hot coals, trying to force her to reveal where her husband's money was hidden, but she never did. Unfortunately, she had to have her leg amputated, and she died 2 years later. Then there's another story about a young girl who had seizures. I don't remember why she had the seizures, but she couldn't hold anything down except for maybe cow's milk, and the family had a cow, and she of course drank the cow's milk. A Yankee soldier tried to steal the cow, but the girl's mother begged him to leave the cow. He left the cow only after killing it. The young girl soon died. Here's her. Here's a copy of her tombstone. Rosanna Twilley died of burns and starvation. She couldn't eat or drink anything but cow's milk. There's another book that's a very good book, Women Will Howl Here it is. By Mary Deborah Pettit. Sherman's troops arrested the women and their children in Roswell, Georgia, after they burned down a mill where they worked. They forced these 400 women and children into wagons, and they were carried about 10 miles away to Marietta, Georgia, where they were shoved into rail cars. Then they were sent north to Kentucky or Indiana and were abandoned. Some of the women had to give away their children. Some people died along the way. But they had to give away their children sometimes because they couldn't care for them. Many starved as it was difficult to find jobs. They were refugees in enemy areas. It is hard to know what happened to all of the women because most were unable to return home to Roswell, Georgia. Sherman, who committed many war crimes on the South, did nothing to encourage slaves to join his army and often deliberately burned down bridges to prevent slaves from following his armies, leaving them alone and isolated without even provisioning them with food and medicine. Many slave children were separated from their parents, and many, both adults and children, died from starvation and disease. In 1863, 2,000 slaves that escaped the Union Army died. In Louisiana, it is estimated that between 1863 and 64, 8,000 slaves left to follow the Union Army. More than half died of exposure. Of course, during the March to the Sea through Georgia, Sherman's troops burned down slave homes, stole whatever meager property slaves held, and often subjected slave women to brutalization and rape. Thousands of former slaves gathered near Natchez, Mississippi, and Union troops forced them into a large ravine, later named the Devil's Punch Bowl, or it was known as a concentration camp, and they would not let the slaves leave. If anyone became ill and died, the troops gave them shovels to bury them where they fell. Here's something else I wanted to show you, a list. There's 58. These are the towns that were destroyed by Sherman and other, maybe some other generals were involved, Union generals were involved, but I think mostly Sherman. Like, let's see, Hernando, Mississippi, partly burned, April 1863. Greenville, Mississippi, burned May 6, 1863. Sibley, Missouri, burned June 28, 1863. And on and on. And some of the towns were burned partially and some were completely burned down. And here's this list. And I'll be glad to share it with you if you want to see it. Sherman was a racist and white supremacist. His treatment of runaway slaves was so evil that despite the fact that his army overflowed with food and supplies, looted from any civilians unlucky enough to be caught in his army's destructive path, he failed to leave behind ample food, medicine, and shelter to serve their needs. But humanitarian concerns, whether it be for prisoners, Southern civilians, slaves, or Native Americans, counted for nothing when set against his goal of annihilating the Confederacy. As long as there was any Confederate resistance to this overriding concern, Sherman believed it was open season on Southern citizens. Sherman's ruthlessness is neatly captured in his 1864 letter to Major R.M. Sawyer. Next year, here's what he said. Next year, their lands will be taken. For in war we can take them and rightfully too, and in another year they may beg in vain for their lives. Sherman knew his premeditated policies were barbaric and cruel, and his mass destruction and violence against civilians was intended to terrorize the civilian population into abandoning the war as the only way to get rid of him. Lincoln's war to preserve the Union was actually for the purpose of killing Southerners and destroying the South for literally generations. Decades after the war, while Northern industrialists were building 100-room cottages at Newport, Rhode Island, Southerners were dying in epidemics, some caused by nutritional deficiency, such as pellagra, yellow fever, and hookworm. Pellagra caused dementia. Hookworm caused catastrophic iron depletion. When the South was illegally invaded, Southern states called upon their sons to do their duty to defend their state, homes, and family from invasion. These men were patriots and heroes who did their duty to protect their homeland from an unjust invasion. Removing the military base names named after Confederate generals is like forcing Reconstruction on the South like they experienced after the war. Stop this cancel culture and respect the 10 military base names as our ancestors did. I believe that the horrors and war crimes committed against Southern citizens was the reason that the federal government decided to make amends and give the military bases Confederate names, and especially after many Confederate descendants gave their services and lives to the U.S. military after the Civil War, in World War I, in World War II, and other battles. The North wanted to reconcile with the South and named 10 bases in the South for Confederate generals. It is wrong a century later to reverse this reconciliation that was given in good faith and for the healing the Southern people and slaves from the atrocities committed against the Southern civilians and slaves during the war. Our Southern states contribute the most military personnel than other sections of the country. Insulting Southerners by changing the 10 military base names could reduce the number of Southerners joining the military. These base names should be left in place as an example of the reunification of the Southern states to the United States of America. I thank you for watching.